The world is often divided by wealth and power, and in this story, those divisions played a crucial role. The rich man was someone who had worked hard to get to where he was. His name was Charles Kensington, and he was the CEO of a successful company that dominated the industry. He wore tailored suits, drove an expensive car, and lived in a mansion on a hill. Everyone around him admired him for his business skills and his ability to make tough decisions. To the outside world, he was the epitome of success, someone who had everything he could possibly want. Then there was Leah Parker, a young woman with dreams of making a better life for herself. Leah had grown up in a small town, raised by a single mother who worked long hours to make ends meet. Leah knew the struggles of her mother, and she was determined to break the cycle of poverty. She had worked hard to earn a job as a secretary at Kensington's company, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was on the right path. She wasn't just going to be another face in the crowd, she was going to make something of herself. Leah was intelligent, hardworking, and ambitious. She quickly gained Charles's attention, not just because of her work ethic but also because of her beauty and charm. She had an infectious smile, and her presence lit up any room she walked into. It didn't take long for Charles to notice her in a way that went beyond just a professional relationship. At first, it was innocent enough casual conversations, exchanging pleasantries in the office, and sharing lunch during breaks. Charles, despite his reputation, was someone who enjoyed the company of others, especially someone as lively and full of energy as Leah. But things changed when they started spending more time together. What started as innocent exchanges grew into something more. There were shared glances, moments that lingered just a little too long, and then one evening, the two of them found themselves alone in Charles's office after hours. The night was filled with tension, and Leah, although she felt uneasy at first, could not deny the attraction she felt towards him. The relationship, while brief, became one that would alter the course of both of their lives in ways they could never have predicted. One night, after a long conversation, things escalated. Charles, usually in control of every aspect of his life, lost his composure, and for a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to give in to his desires. Leah, caught up in the moment, reciprocated. Leah's life was not easy, but she refused to let the hardships define her. Every day, she worked tirelessly to make sure her son, Marcus, would have a better future. While her past had been filled with pain, she never allowed it to overshadow the love she felt for her son. He was her light, the reason she kept pushing forward, no matter how tough life became. The day finally arrived. Marcus had prepared himself for what he was about to do, but not after Marcus's confrontation with Charles, the weight of everything began to settle. For years, Marcus had wondered what would come of his quest for justice. He had expected anger, maybe even satisfaction, but instead, he felt a sense of calm. The confrontation with his father had been difficult, but it had been necessary. He didn't need Charles's forgiveness, and he didn't expect him to change overnight. What he needed was for the truth to be heard and for his mother's sacrifices to be recognized. Charles Kensington, though still reeling from the conversation, began to reflect on his own life in a way he never had before. The world had turned against him, and he had lost nearly everything that once defined him. His company, once his pride and joy, was teetering on the brink of collapse. He had tried everything to fix it, but his efforts had only made things worse. He couldn't undo his mistakes, and he knew it. But what Marcus had said that day, the truth about consequences and accountability, resonated deeply within him. Charles had spent so many years burying his guilt beneath his wealth and status, thinking that money could solve everything. But now, it was clear to him that wealth and power couldn't erase the hurt he had caused. He couldn't erase the pain in Leah's eyes when she had been forced to leave, nor could he undo the years of struggle she had faced while raising Marcus. The truth, no matter how much he wanted to hide from it, would always be there. Over the next few months, Charles's life continued to spiral, but in an unexpected way, his encounter with Marcus sparked something within him. While he couldn't fix the past, he began to understand that he still had the ability to do something meaningful in the present. Slowly, Charles started making changes. He reached out to old colleagues, seeking to rebuild connections, not for profit, but to regain a sense of respect, something he had lost long ago. But even more important than the business changes were the personal changes. Charles made the decision to donate a significant portion of his wealth to various charities. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because he finally understood that success wasn't just about building an empire. It was about making a positive difference in the world, especially to the people you had wronged. Charles began working with organizations that helped single mothers, particularly those who had been abandoned and forced to raise children alone. He knew that, in some small way, he could try to make amends for the way he had treated Leah. Meanwhile, Leah's life continued to flourish, though she remained humble. The boutique she had started had grown, and she had hired several employees who shared her work ethic and values. She had always been proud of the life she had built, not because of the business success, but because of the way she had raised Marcus. She had taught him to value kindness, humility, and hard work. As he grew older, Marcus took those lessons to heart, deciding to pursue a career in law. He wanted to work not for money or fame, but to help those who had been wronged and to ensure justice was served. Leah knew that her life had not been easy, but she had always believed that the struggle was worth it. Watching Marcus grow into a compassionate and successful man filled her with pride. It was clear that he was ready to make his own mark on the world. And yet, as proud as she was of him, there was still a part of her that wondered if Marcus would ever fully understand the truth about his father. She knew he had made peace with the past, but some things were too difficult to forget. As Marcus continued his career, he found himself driven by a desire to make the world a better place. His interactions with clients, many of whom had experienced their own struggles, filled him with purpose. Marcus had learned that true success was not measured by wealth, but by the impact you had on others' lives. He became involved in several community projects, working with young people to mentor them and provide opportunities for those who, like him and his mother, had faced adversity. Though his career kept him busy, Marcus also began to explore ways to reconnect with his past. One day, he decided to visit Leah's old boutique, now a thriving business. As he walked through the door, the familiar scent of fresh fabric and coffee filled the air. The warmth and kindness that had always been a part of the shop were still present. Leah was there, of course, managing things as always. When she saw Marcus, a smile spread across her face. He had grown into a man of integrity, someone she could be proud of. It wasn't just the business that had grown, their relationship had also deepened over the years. Marcus had started to understand just how much his mother had sacrificed for him. Their bond was one of mutual respect and love, something that had only strengthened with time. Leah had always been the one who provided for him, guided him, and helped him become the man he was. But now, it was clear that Marcus was becoming a source of strength and support for her as well. Despite everything they had been through, Leah and Marcus had built a life together that was full of hope and purpose. They had learned from the past, but they had not let it define their future. As Marcus grew into his career, he found a sense of fulfillment in helping others. He knew that his journey was just beginning, and he hoped to continue making a difference, not just for himself, but for those who had been overlooked and marginalized, much like his mother had once been. For Charles, the road to redemption was long. He didn't expect forgiveness, and he didn't want it. What he wanted was to change the way he lived, to show that even after making terrible mistakes, it was still possible to take responsibility for those mistakes and try to make amends. He had lost his family, his business, and his reputation, but in return, he had gained something more important, the understanding that true success was about giving back, about owning up to your actions, and about treating others with the dignity and respect they deserved. In the end, the story wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about growth, healing, and redemption. Marcus had learned that justice didn't always come in the form of punishment, but in the form of understanding and change. Charles had learned that it was never too late to take responsibility for the harm you've caused, and to make a difference, even in the smallest of ways. And Leah, despite all the pain she had endured, had learned that resilience and love were the keys to moving forward, no matter how difficult the past had been. Though the past could never be erased, their future was something they had the power to shape. Together, they had built lives of meaning and purpose, each in their own way, and in the end, that was the greatest victory of ALL.NG could fully prepare him for the moment when he would come face to face with Charles Kensington. He had grown up with a story in his mind, a story of a man who had abandoned him and his mother, leaving behind nothing but pain and unanswered questions. But Marcus knew this was bigger than just a personal grudge. It was about holding someone accountable for their actions, about seeking justice for the woman who had raised him, worked tirelessly to provide for him, and never once asked for anything in return. Charles Kensington, once a towering figure of success, now sat in his office staring at the remains of the empire he had worked so hard to build. The walls of his luxurious office seemed to close in around him as he reflected on his life, the mistakes he had made, and the people he had hurt along the way. The days of power and prestige were long gone. His company was in shambles, his reputation in tatters, and his family was drifting away from him. In the quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, the guilt always returned. He thought of Leah and her child, of the life he had thrown away without a second thought. But as much as he regretted his actions, he couldn't change the past. The realization that he had destroyed everything that had once mattered to him weighed heavily on him. He had made so many wrong choices, and now it was all unraveling. He couldn't even escape the constant reminder of his failure because the media was relentless. The headlines, the interviews, the phone calls, it was all too much. In the midst of this turmoil, Charles's secretary stepped into his office with an unusual message. "There's someone here to see you," she said. Her tone was polite but reserved, as though she knew something was about to shift in the air. Charles raised an eyebrow. He wasn't expecting anyone. "Who is it?" he asked, trying to mask the unease he felt deep within. "It's Marcus," she replied. The name struck Charles like a punch to the gut. Marcus. The son he had abandoned. The child he had never acknowledged. The child who had lived with the consequences of his actions for years. Marcus walked into the office with confidence, his back straight and his expression firm. He was no longer the young boy who had been hurt by his father's actions. He was now a man, a successful young lawyer who had worked hard to get to where he was. As he walked toward Charles's desk, he couldn't help but feel a surge of emotion. This was the man who had caused so much pain, who had turned his back on his mother and on him. But Marcus wasn't here to relieve the past, he was here to make sure that history didn't repeat itself. Charles looked up at Marcus, his face a mixture of surprise and guilt. The years had not been kind to him, and seeing Marcus now, standing before him, reminded him of everything he had lost. "Marcus," he said, his voice shaky, "I didn't expect you to come here." Marcus didn't waste time on pleasantries. He had a purpose, and he wasn't going to let the man in front of him off easy. "I think it's time we had a conversation, don't you?" Marcus replied, his tone calm but filled with an underlying firmness. Charles looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting nervously. He had spent so many years avoiding the truth, burying the guilt deep inside him, hoping that it would just go away. But now, with Marcus standing in front of him, it was impossible to ignore. "I never wanted things to end up like this," Charles said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "I never thought things would fall apart like they have." Marcus's voice remained steady as he responded, "You didn't think about any of this when you fired my mother, did you? You didn't think about the consequences, or the pain you caused. You only thought about yourself." Charles swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He wanted to defend himself, to explain the choices he had made, but he knew that there were no excuses. There was no defending what he had done. His actions had hurt too many people, and Marcus had every right to be angry. "I was wrong," Charles finally admitted, his voice thick with regret. "I made a terrible mistake, and I can't undo it. I can't go back and change what I did to your mother. I know I hurt both of you, and for that, I'm truly sorry." Marcus didn't say anything right away. He had waited so long to hear those words, but now that he had, they didn't feel like enough. The apology, though sincere, couldn't erase the years of pain. It couldn't undo the decisions that had shaped his life. "You can't change the past," Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm. "But you can take responsibility for it. And you can make sure it never happens again." Charles looked up at Marcus, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and admiration. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to understand the damage you've caused," Marcus replied. "I want you to understand what it means to be held accountable for your actions. My mother never asked for your apology, and she never wanted anything from you. But I'm not her. I'm here to make sure you understand that your choices have consequences. And you don't get to hide from them anymore." There was a long silence between them, each man lost in his own thoughts. Charles had spent years trying to forget the mistakes he had made, but now, with Marcus's words hanging in the air, he realized that he couldn't escape the truth. He had to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how difficult it was. For Marcus, the conversation wasn't about getting revenge. It was about making sure that Charles understood the impact of what he had done. It was about ensuring that his mother's strength and resilience were not forgotten. It was about making sure that the man who had destroyed their lives would no longer be able to hide behind his wealth and power. "I don't expect you to fix everything," Marcus said, his voice softer now. "But I do expect you to make things right. And I expect you to do better for the people you've hurt and for the people who still trust you." Charles nodded slowly, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. "I'll try," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "I can't change what's been done, but I'll do everything I can to make things right from here on out." As Marcus turned to leave, he felt a sense of closure that he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't about forgiveness, and it wasn't about erasing the past. It was about acknowledging the truth, about holding someone accountable for their actions. And in that moment, Marcus knew that he had done exactly what he set out to do. At first, things were difficult. Leah had to juggle several jobs just to make ends meet. The years passed, Charles Kensington's once prominent empire began to crumble. What had once been a shining example of business success started to show cracks. The company that had been the backbone of his wealth and status faced more challenges than Charles had anticipated. New competitors, shifting market demands, and his own poor choices began to catch up with him. Charles, a man who had always prided himself on control, found himself in a situation he couldn't manage. The downfall was slow at first, but it became inevitable. His stock prices dropped, clients began to lose trust, and employees were starting to leave in droves. He'd built his fortune on carefully calculated risks, but now, the same kind of decisions he'd made without a second thought were catching up with him. The once sturdy foundation of his business was now shaky, and he felt the weight of every decision. As the company spiraled, Charles tried everything he could to save it. He hired new managers, made promises to his investors, and tried to reinvent himself as a leader. But nothing worked. The media began to question his business practices, and whispers of dishonesty and corruption started to surface. The man who had once been admired for his sharp mind and business acumen now found himself a subject of ridicule. His name, which had once been synonymous with success, was now associated with failure. At home, things were no better. Charles's marriage, once a public symbol of stability, began to fall apart. His wife, who had always stood by his side, began to distance herself from him. The tension between them grew as his career faltered. She had stood by him through many ups and downs, but this was different. The man she married was no longer the same. Charles had become obsessed with trying to restore his image and his wealth, but in doing so, he had lost sight of everything else. The relationship became strained, and they spent more time apart than together. As time went on, Charles found himself increasingly isolated. His friends from the business world began to distance themselves, and the media continued to cast a shadow over his reputation. Charles had always been a man who thrived on the approval of others, and now, with every new headline and every failed business venture, he felt like he was losing everything. His wealth, once a constant source of comfort, now seemed meaningless. In the quiet moments, Charles found himself thinking back to the time when he had first met Leah Parker. He remembered how young and vibrant she had been, and how much he had admired her. But that memory was tainted by guilt. He knew that the way he had treated her had been wrong. He had used her, then discarded her, as if she were nothing more than a fleeting moment in his life. The thought of his child, his son, Marcus, haunted him, and Charles could never quite shake the guilt that followed him for years. The memories of that time, when Leah had left the city, began to resurface. He had fired her without a second thought, thinking it was the easy way out. But now, with his life falling apart, he realized just how much he had lost. Leah had been strong, independent, and capable of so much more. And yet, he had thrown her aside, believing that his wealth and power would be enough to keep everything under control. Charles knew deep down that he couldn't undo what had been done, but he couldn't help but wish he had taken a different path. He wondered what might have happened if he had taken responsibility for his actions, if he had stood by Leah instead of pushing her away. But those thoughts were fleeting. He couldn't change the past, and the present was too overwhelming to focus on anything else. Meanwhile, Leah had built a life for herself. She had worked tirelessly to raise Marcus, to give him the best life she could despite the challenges she faced. Her small business, which had once been a humble idea, had blossomed into something more. Over the years, she had gained the respect of her community, becoming known for her hard work and determination. The boutique she had started was now a staple in the town, a place where people came not just for the products, but for the feeling of warmth and care that Leah infused into everything she did. Marcus had grown into a fine young man, intelligent, confident, and compassionate. He had taken after his mother in many ways, inheriting her resilience and work ethic. Leah's sacrifices had not been in vain. Her son was everything she had hoped for and more. Marcus had excelled in school, and he had a bright future ahead of him. But more than that, he had the kind of heart that would make a difference in the world. Now, as an adult, Marcus was ready to make his mark. He had graduated from college with honors and earned a law degree. But despite his success, something inside him had been nagging at him for years. He knew that he had to confront the man who had caused his mother so much pain. He couldn't let his father's actions go unanswered. Charles, once a powerful figure, was now facing the consequences of his past. His company was on the brink of collapse, and his personal life was in shambles. The thought of confronting the man who had abandoned them, who had fired his mother so callously, was something Marcus had long considered. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. He had always respected his mother for the way she handled everything. She never once spoke ill of Charles, and she never sought revenge. But Marcus knew that he couldn't let this go. He had grown up without a father, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that his mother had been left to deal with everything alone. She had been treated unfairly, and now it was time for the truth to come out. Marcus had worked hard to get to where he was, and he was ready to face Charles Kensington. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined. He had spent years preparing for this moment, and now, with everything falling into place, he knew it was time. One day, Marcus walked into his office, his mind made up. He knew exactly what he needed to do. As the phone rang, he picked it up, his voice steady and calm. "I need to see Charles Kensington," he said. It was a simple request, but it was one that would set the stage for a confrontation that neither of them could have predicted. She worked long hours at a local diner, her hands often sore from serving food and cleaning tables. But even with all the work, her pride and determination kept her going. She would never allow herself to ask for help. She wasn't the type of person to rely on others, especially after everything that had happened with Charles. Marcus was just a baby when she moved back to her hometown. His father's identity remained a secret, and Leah knew it was better that way. She didn't want her son to grow up with the weight of knowing how his father had treated her. Instead, she focused on raising him to be kind, humble, and hardworking. She told him stories about strong, independent women, teaching him to appreciate the strength it took to rise above difficult circumstances. As Marcus grew older, he quickly became aware of the struggles his mother faced. He saw how hard she worked, how late she stayed up at night, and how many sacrifices she made for him. Even at a young age, Marcus understood that his mother had given up everything for him. It wasn't just about the material things. It was the love, the care, and the support that Leah gave him, no matter what. Leah's small business, a local boutique, began to take off. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She had always loved fashion and design, and she poured all her passion into the store. Slowly, she began to build a loyal customer base. Word spread, and people from nearby towns started to visit her shop. Leah's reputation as a hard-working, honest businesswoman grew. She wasn't just a mother trying to make ends meet anymore. She was an inspiration to others in the community. Marcus watched his mother's growth with pride. As he got older, he became determined to do everything he could to support her. He focused on his studies, determined to make his mother proud. Leah encouraged him every step of the way, always reminding him that hard work and dedication would get him far in life. Marcus took those words to heart. He excelled in school, not only because he was intelligent but because he had the drive to succeed. As the years passed, Marcus became a young man filled with potential. He graduated from high school with honors and earned a scholarship to a prestigious university. His dream was to study business and law, combining both fields to make a difference in the world. But more than anything, he wanted to make sure his mother would never have to struggle again. Leah, as proud as she was of her son, couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. She had worked so hard to give him the best life she could, but she knew that, despite everything, there would always be something missing. She had never been able to tell him the truth about his father. The pain of that secret weighed on her heart every day. Marcus, being the curious and intelligent young man he was, began to ask questions. He noticed how his mother would become quiet whenever someone mentioned his father. It wasn't just about the absence of his father in their lives. It was the way Leah reacted, the way her eyes would cloud over with pain. It was as if there was a secret she was carrying that she couldn't share. One day, when Marcus was around 18, he finally confronted his mother. He sat her down and asked, "Mom, why does it seem like there's something you're not telling me about my dad?" Leah's heart sank. She had always hoped that Marcus would never ask that question. She had spent years protecting him from the truth, but now, as he was becoming a young adult, she realized that she couldn't hide it forever. Leah took a deep breath and decided that it was time to tell him. She knew that he deserved the truth, even if it was painful. "Marcus," she began, her voice trembling, "your father, his name is Charles Kensington. He was the CEO of a big company, and he was a wealthy man. But he wasn't just your father. He's someone who hurt me, someone who made choices that changed the course of our lives." Marcus was shocked. He had never imagined that his father could be someone like Charles Kensington. He had heard of the man, of course everyone in the town had. Charles was a well-known figure, admired for his success and wealth. But Marcus had never connected him to his own life. Leah went on to explain the details of what had happened. She told Marcus about the affair, about how Charles had promised her everything and then turned his back on her when she became pregnant. She explained how he had fired her from her job, trying to cover up his actions, and how she had to rebuild her life from nothing. She told him how, despite the pain, she had never once regretted having him, her beloved son. Marcus sat in silence as his mother spoke. He didn't know what to think. On one hand, he was angry that his father had abandoned them. On the other hand, he felt sympathy for his mother, who had carried the burden of that secret for so many years. He didn't know how to react to this revelation, but one thing was clear: he wasn't going to let his father's mistakes define him. The more Marcus thought about it, the more determined he became to make sure that his mother's sacrifices were not in vain. He wasn't going to let the man who had caused so much pain walk away scot-free. He knew that it was time for him to take matters into his own hands. He was going to find Charles Kensington, the man who had wronged his mother, and he was going to make sure that justice was served. Leah, of course, was worried. She didn't want Marcus to confront Charles. She didn't want him to relieve the pain of their past. But Marcus was determined. He knew what he had to do, and he wasn't going to stop until he got the answers he needed. As Marcus began his journey to find Charles Kensington, he did so not out of anger, but out of a deep sense of justice. He wanted to make sure that his mother's suffering wasn't forgotten, that the man who had hurt them both would finally face the consequences of his actions. Little did he know that this journey would not only change his life but would also lead him to a confrontation that no one could have predicted. The morning after was a blur. Both of them went back to their regular lives, pretending like nothing had happened, but things had changed. Leah soon discovered that she was pregnant. At first, she didn't know what to do. She didn't want to disappoint her mother, and she certainly didn't want to cause any trouble at work. The news filled her with fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. She had a choice to make, but before she could make it, fate intervened. Charles, realizing that Leah's pregnancy might pose a problem for him and his pristine reputation, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He couldn't afford for the scandal to reach the public. His image as a successful, powerful businessman would be ruined, and he knew it. So, in a cold, calculated move, he called Leah into his office. He told her that the company was going through a restructuring process and, unfortunately, her position was no longer available. Leah was shocked. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had worked so hard to get where she was, and now, just like that, she was being let go. But Charles didn't stop there. He made it clear that it would be best for her to leave town and keep quiet about the situation. He offered her a severance package, which, though generous, was nothing compared to what she had built with her own hard work. She was devastated, but she had no choice. She needed the money to survive, to take care of herself and the child growing inside her. Her dreams of a better life seemed to vanish in an instant. She moved back to her small hometown, away from the bustling city and the job she had worked so hard to get. The pregnancy was not easy for Leah. She had to deal with judgment from some members of her community, who whispered behind her back, and even from her own family, who didn't understand the situation. But through it all, she kept her head high. She wasn't going to let Charles or anyone else dictate her life. Leah knew that no matter what, she would raise her child to the best of her ability. She had always been independent and determined, and now more than ever, she had to be strong. She found work at a local diner, where she worked long hours. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't pay much, but she was able to make ends meet. Over time, she started to make a name for herself in the community. Her determination and hard work paid off, and she was able to save enough money to start her own small business. The rich man, on the other hand, had moved on. Charles went back to his life, never once looking back at the consequences of his actions. He continued to run his company, making decisions that affected the lives of so many people. He married someone else, someone who could help boost his public image, and started a family of his own. On the outside, everything seemed perfect for him. But as the years passed, there were moments when his past haunted him. He never forgot Leah, even if he tried to push the memory away. There were nights when he would lie awake, questioning if he had made the right choice. But those thoughts never lasted long. He had his company, his wealth, and his status. Those things mattered more to him than anything else. Leah, however, was building a new life for herself and her son. She wasn't interested in revenge or in making Charles pay for what he had done. Instead, she focused on giving her child everything he needed. She raised him to understand the value of hard work, integrity, and most importantly, compassion. She wanted him to know that no matter how difficult life could be, it was always worth fighting for a better future. And in those quiet moments, when she looked at her son's face, Leah knew that she had made the right choice, even if it had cost her everything she once thought she wanted.